If it's a valuable job, whatever level they're doing it at, they should get recognition for it and reward.
Welcome to Island Influencers, where we share stories of successful business owners, experienced professionals, entrepreneurs and community leaders based or with influence in the Isle of Man. This podcast is brought to you by Thornton Chartered Financial Planners, because great financial planning has the power to change your life. Now here's your host, Chartered Financial Planner Sharon Sutton.
Welcome to this week's episode of Island Influencers podcast, where experienced professionals, entrepreneurs and community leaders based in the Isle of Man are invited on to share their stories with us. I'm your host, Sharon Sutton, and I'm joined today by Dr Fenella Bazin. Fenella has pioneered academic research into Manx music as Director of Postgraduate Studies at the Centre for Manx Studies. Her own doctoral thesis on Manx music up to 1896 opened up areas of research for other students and helped put Manx music on the map. Without her work, we would know little about the development of traditional music, West Gallery music, or even the National Anthem. Fenella's expertise in the sphere of Manx music is internationally recognised. She's contributed articles, papers and chapters to leading publications, spoken at numerous conferences and led workshops. Her research has consistently promoted the Isle of Man and its culture. Fenella's accomplishments outside of academia are wide-ranging. She succeeded in making Manx music accessible to a wide range of people of all ages and has worked hard for festivals such as the Manx Music Festival and Ian Criniacht, which is now known as the Celtic Gathering. She's also well known as an excellent musician, a fiddle player, a singer and a pianist, as well as an arranger and composer and published author. Fenella works hard for a local community of Ballaugh, and she leads the church choir. She's a member of Ballaugh Heritage Trust and has acted as a governor for Ballaugh School. And what's unique about Fenella is how she draws from all these achievements to be a major draw on prestigious heritage cruise ships throughout the world, particularly now to the Baltic and further north, promoting the story of the Isle of Man. Whether you're interested in knowing more about what it takes to do a successful research doctorate or how to be a successful professional public speaker, then I hope you do enjoy this episode of Island Influencers podcast. Welcome, Fenella, to the Island Influencers podcast. Fenella, I'm really excited about this conversation because I think your research background, as well as your experience in being a successful professional speaker, can offer our listeners not only an insight into the world of the Isle of Man's rich heritage, but also around the discipline needed to be a successful public and professional speaker. You know, the habits that you've developed and learned both in business and in life. But to kick off this conversation, I'd like to go back in time with you, if that's okay. So where did you grow up?
Well, thanks for asking me to come on the programme, on this podcast for a start. Well, I was born in Ramsey, quite unusually, because most people are born in Douglas at the Jane, but it was during the war, towards the end of the war. And because of the shortage of petrol, they couldn't afford for people to take vehicles between Ramsey and Douglas. So there was a little nursing home in Ramsey, Brook Hill Road, with that wonderful round tower, which was the maternity area of the building.
Goodness.
So I was born in a round tower in Ramsey, overlooking Ramsey Bay.
Goodness. So, could you tell me a little bit about island life? I mean, obviously when you started to grow up a little bit, but how was Ramsey back in those days?
I seem to remember it being much darker. If you think about the courthouse area now, which is a lovely area, they've got the seating there and the statue, and it's a real sort of centre for people to come to. But in my young days, it was railed off.
Okay.
There were high railings all the way around. The shops, of course, were much smaller, and the town was smaller, so more people knew each other, of course. My grandparents, I had one set of grandparents living in Ramsey, the other set, and by the time I was growing up, my grandfather had died, who's no longer farming. My other grandmother moved to Douglas, but my Ramsey grandparents, of course, knew a lot of people, because my grandfather was the manager of the co-op.
Okay, so the real centre of the community,
it's a real
hub. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. So, there was a lot going on. And I was at school, first of all, in Albert Road, of course.
I remember that one myself.
I remember that.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
And a rather gaunt building, if you remember it, with a boys' playground and a girls' playground.
It was all one when I was there.
Was it? Well, it was still very much separated in those days. And I don't know if this is my memory playing tricks, but I seem to remember that the toilets were out in the yard and they didn't have roofs on. but I might be dreaming that. But what I do remember is every morning we had to drink our third of a pint of milk, which was sort of compulsory in those days because they felt that children might not be getting the nourishment that they should be and the nutrition. And it was always kept out in the warmth. So when we got it, this was a sort of lukewarm milk, which was not a pleasant thing. But what was fun was that they had cardboard tops with holes in, so we made pom-poms using the cardboard tops.
Right, okay.
So there you are. It's a very different childhood from today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So from growing up in Ramsey, I mean, what was the process of getting into academia? I mean, did you went to university, I presume?
I was at Ramsey Grammar School for a year, and then my parents moved off the island. My father had been very ill. Farming was in quite a bad state in the 1950s, and the island was going through a very bad depression. The population was down to something like 50,000.
Gosh.
And he joined the Ministry of Agriculture, and they posted him to Kent, which is about as far away as you could get. In the days before motorways, you had to drive through, to get from Ashford in Kent to Liverpool, you had to drive right through Hyde Park Corner. So it's a very different sort of way of life. I was lucky to go to what was called a girls' grammar school, Ashford County Grammar School for Girls. And then my father was posted to Oxford, and I was at school in Oxford for 4 years. And then from there I went to the Royal Academy of Music for 3 years, did my graduate course there, and then a teaching diploma at the University of Liverpool after that.
Gosh.
So that was interesting. And in those days, of course, being a musician was very different in the Royal Academy. Then it was very, very proper, very straight-laced. There was one person who played jazz. And of course now there are whole departments dedicated to that sort of music.
Yes, of course. So how did you end up getting yourself back to the Isle of Man then? Was that through the teaching, really?
Well, I taught in just outside of Manchester for a while, and then worked in in Birmingham for a year on a very different sort of job, and then decided that wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and was fortunate enough to having answered an advert by Birmingham University for someone in the extramural department, applied for it, and much to my amazement, and I think to other people's amazement too, I was actually given it.
Goodness me.
So that began my lifelong interest in lifelong learning.
Yeah, goodness.
And it's become really the heart of what I've done since 1970.
And how did you then manage to find your way back to here? Because I seem to remember knowing of you in the 70s anyway,
yes,
so you were a resident then, I guess.
We came back in 1977, or at least I came back, Michael came with me. All sorts of things, I won't go into the complications of it, but we decided that this is a good place to live, and perhaps sitting in Birmingham on a wet March afternoon made the decision for us.
I seem to remember at the time that you had this idea, along with a few others, to have a go at reviving certain parts of the Manx culture. And so how did that play from getting from a classical background, very proper, as you've said, to being able to have more of an influence with the more indigenous music from here? I'd
always been interested in it because at Albert Road I had won a prize, and my prize was the Manx National Songbook as a prize at Albert Road School. And I knew those songs off by heart, and I was really interested in them. I didn't know about the manuscripts in the Manx Museum at that point, of course. I don't think anyone else did. Certainly in the 50s and 60s, they were a bit of a well, probably no one knew about them at all.
No.
And when I was doing my sixth form at school, my A-level, we had to do an essay. I wanted to do it on music of the Celtic world. And my head of department told me very firmly, no, there's not enough material in that to do it.
There wasn't any internet in those days.
So I rather wish she was still around to know that I'd actually done a PhD just on the music of one island, and that other people have done more doctorates on that since.
Yes. Gosh.
So it's an interesting how things have changed.
It is. And so what was the major sources, given that you were told you couldn't do that? How did you go about finding it?
Well, she told me I couldn't do it. There was no point in doing it. So
yes,
I can't remember what else I did.
Right,
I did something else which has completely vanished from my mind.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't particularly interested in it.
Well, isn't it funny how the things that you want to remember, you remember? That's I know that's good. So how did you tell me about your time when you came back to Ramsey then, and what eventually led you to set up the Criniac Festival, the Celtic Festival, in the non-profit sector?
Right. Well, it's a long story again. My mother was also at Albert Road School in her youth when Mona Douglas was teaching dancing there.
Gosh.
So, of course, my mother knew Mona well from a long time ago. And as soon as she heard that my parents were back on the island, because they came back a few years before we did, she got in touch, and of course when I got back, first thing I knew was Mona getting in touch to see if I would be able to help her with the Chronic. My father was already doing some work for her, and at that time Ewan Kelly was the secretary. He had a warehouse, a place out at Derby on the estate. And then my father took over the secretaryship, and then eventually I took that over from him. And, this was something I was really interested in. I loved the music, I loved the whole background, the language. Because, again, my father was a big influence, because back in the late 40s, I suppose, early 50s, he actually went to Manx classes with people like Bill Radcliffe, who are now names to
they are revered names,
yes.
aren't they?
So he was interested in Manx history and the language and culture in general, which was quite unusual in those days, because certainly at school we were told, if you want to get on, forget about the Isle of Man, just look eastwards to Britain.
It's so different now, isn't it?
It's very different now, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much that we can go into from what you've said, but what I want to start with something that I know that that I'm guilty of. I think but what does it take to become persistent with regards to things like becoming good at public speaking in particular? I mean, how do you build regular good habits to learn how to do that? Because you've managed to build the later part of your career into being a sought after speaker.
Well, I think it's like any performance. You've got to love doing it for a start. There's no point in standing up in front of people if you're terrified and you don't want to do it. You've got to know your subject. You've got to have that absolutely part of you, not just something that you're reading from notes. Mm-hmm. But above all, I think you just want to love telling people about things and trying to widen their knowledge or to get them interested in something. I think the biggest compliment I can ever get is someone coming up to me afterwards and saying, that was really interesting, I'm just going off to find out more about it now. And that's really what I want to hear, just opening doors for people. Yeah. I think that's the key to it.
Yeah, so loving what you do and, helping others, isn't it? It's a really powerful driver. How did you decide that you were going to go ahead and do a PhD? Because that's a pretty big chunk to get out of your life to go and do that.
I did it part-time while I was working full-time.
Yes.
And the reason I did it was almost a sort of challenge that someone else put down for me, and I can't resist a challenge.
Like you can't do this.
No, it wasn't that. It was just that someone else was going to do one, and I thought, well, if they can, so can I. And it was going to be a master's originally, and then within a year it turned into a PhD.
And which university was that attached to?
Liverpool.
That was Liverpool as well, right? Okay.
And again, because I'd done a lot of work in previous decades on Manx music, I hit the ground running. So many people, when they embark on a doctorate, have to spend the first year finding out what they want to do and what areas, whereas I'd already read a lot of the material, a lot of it was there in place, ready to work on.
Okay, so you had a lot of source material, and I guess
exactly.
Others having followed in your path have had your doctorate and the research that you put down in order to base theirs on as well.
That's right, yes. And that's, at the end of the final chapter of each PhD says that these following areas need to be followed up. And I think virtually all the areas that I identified have been either followed up in either as masters or PhDs since then.
Oh, that's really great.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah, isn't it just? If you don't mind me asking, and I primarily ask this when I meet people in my role as a financial planner, what's your earliest memory of money?
Well, money boxes.
Okay. Okay.
And yes, that's the thing. Every child was given a money box. I have one still upstairs. It's in the shape of a little black pig with flowers on. And my name actually painted on it.
Oh, isn't that cute?
And you couldn't open it. But I learnt very quickly that I could actually get a knife and sort of manage to get the half crowns or the florins, the 2-shilling pieces out of it.
How?
If I knew, well, just by turning it upside down and fiddling around with the knife and sliding them out.
Okay. I think there was taking a lot of patience with that. So, I mean, how was money growing up?
Not a lot of it.
Yeah.
I had pocket money. I remember it going up to £1 a week, which is 5p a week.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a lot to buy anyway.
No, and I guess at this point you were in Kent, were you? Or?
No, this was still in the Isle of Man.
Yeah, okay.
I don't remember what happened in Kent. I must have had pocket money, but I can't remember that. But certainly you saved up in those days too, which is good. You had a savings bank book, post office savings book. You tried to put some in. I've still got my old one somewhere. I think I didn't throw it away.
You established good regular savings.
Yes.
So it's a good lesson for our listeners, any young listeners. I know you're passionate about the community, and of course the purpose of this podcast is to strengthen the business community in the Isle of Man. I mean, how did you think of community from a business point of view in enhancing or perhaps leveraging your business profile? I mean, I suppose, well, I'll let you answer it. What do you think?
I'm not sure I've really thought very much about it.
It's just sort of accidental with the source material.
Yes, I think too that probably when we were first involved with the Cruinich, there was a lot of going around to individuals, other than sources of funding, but individuals in shops and so on are trying to get them interested so that they would put up a poster. Can you believe having to persuade them to put up posters? Well, you probably know about that because you're involved.
Yes, no, I remember. Yeah. I remember trying to hang banners of Parliament Street and...
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
that was fun.
That was fun. If a little precarious, I think health and safety assessments might find suspect in those processes.
But you can't separate the business from the community anyway. It's all part of it. So it's an intrinsic part of it.
No, absolutely.
Part of it.
I mean, when it came to getting on the cruises, do you think how did they approach you? How did that opportunity come about?
It was all sort of fairly random and fairly accidental. To begin with, Michael and I went on what we were going to be once in a lifetime cruise, which was along the Norwegian coast in 2002. Mm-hmm. And within a few months was back again on that trip with a group of people, because I'd got in touch with John Shakespeare, who had Legends at that point. Yes. And we put together a package and took, I think, a couple of dozen people, did several trips like that. And then eventually that company got in touch with me and asked if I would like to work for them and just to give the occasional lecture on so maybe just 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks a year at the most. And then someone on that trip said, well, why didn't I get in touch with an agent? Which is what I did, and then it's grown from there. So I could only do so much when I was working as well, because you can't take that much time off work. No. And you've got I had a lot of things to do here as well. So it tended to be just a couple of weeks a year, or maybe 3 weeks a year at that point, and then it's just grown. And while I can, taking the opportunity, because, it's just a wonderful thing to do, great fun. Yeah. And one of the joys of it is meeting so many interesting people, which is, if it was just going and giving lectures and sort of doing nothing else, it would be a bit boring. But the feedback and the chats that we have with people and things that we learn about what they've done, it's absolutely amazing.
And where do you find most of these people are from that are, really interested in the island?
Well, the company I do most of the work for at the moment, which is Viking Ocean, are mainly from the US and Canada.
Okay, so they're like heritage cruises and people want to know about their roots, is it? Or
No. These are just interest cruises, but Viking is a company which says they want people to learn about where they're going. So they have this enrichment program. There's usually 4 lecturers on board at any one time. I have a role as a resident historian, which means I can be on for 4 or 6 weeks at a time. Mm-hmm. And giving lectures just to give... I like to describe them as reminding people of what they'd forgotten they once knew.
Okay. I think there's many business lessons like that, to be honest with you, but okay.
Which is actually quite a good thing to do from the point of view of lecturing anyway. It's the fundamental rule of teaching. Start with what people know, mm-hmm. and then build on that.
So how do you prepare for something like that? Do you have a subject that you start with, or that you've developed over the years, or do you keep to the same subject and just develop that?
It depends. If I'm going on as a resident historian, I have to talk about particular topics, but I try and make them different every time, and try and keep my knowledge of the research that's happening, the latest research, because that's really interesting, because all sorts of ideas that we used to have been blown apart recently, because that's what research does, of course. Yes. So I do a lot of myth-busting, mm-hmm. because a lot of people who are on the cruises sort of were at school maybe 40, 50 years ago. Okay. Even longer, some of them.
Favourite myth?
Favourite myth, King Harold, who got shot in the eye, probably wasn't shot in the eye. Okay. Because contemporary accounts describes a very different death, rather, much more brutal one in many ways. But it was a medieval iconic idea that if you were shot on the eye, it meant you were a liar, that you had been telling untruths. Right. So if you died from a shot in the eye, that was you were a real rogue. A real rogue, yes. Mm. So that was some sort of propaganda that was put round probably after his death.
By the victors, yeah.
By the victors, yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. That's one I didn't know. Fenella, when you look back at your career journey to today, what are you most proud of?
Probably just sort of still being alive. No, it's a really difficult question to answer. It would have been different decades, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think probably in many ways. Oh, I don't know.
Getting your PhD must have been a fairly proud moment.
It was a proud moment, but there are others which I think are probably less in the way of an achievement, but things that I'm proud of as well. So
things that people have picked up after you, like the Crugnac's still running, the Celtic Festival still running along today.
Yes, that I've been able to sow some seeds, maybe.
Yes, oh, you definitely did that. Yeah. I remember you being at school as one of our music teachers, I think, at one point. I don't know, maybe you were doing your PhD at the same time.
No, I was teaching well before I did the PhD. I did that in later life. I was 50 when I got my PhD.
Okay.
But I was doing some supply work at Ramsey at the time.
Yes.
In fact, I did supply work on music on most of the schools on the island except Peel, I think.
Right, but it wasn't built then, I suppose.
It was just beginning to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that was fun to do as well.
So you've inspired lots of youngsters through music.
I hope so.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm one. So of all the things you've done throughout your life so far, what things then have given you the most fulfilment? More of the same, or
probably more of the same? Yes.
Playing? Do you still get much fulfilment out of playing?
I don't have a lot of time at the moment. I'm hoping to get a little bit more time to play. I occasionally play chamber music, which is great fun, which I love.
There's no piano on the ships, I don't suppose.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Great. So, tell me, what are the best things about living in the Isle of Man?
Right. I think, can I sort of narrow that down to living somewhere like Ballaugh? Because living in Douglas is a very different thing, I think. I
would say so.
Living in Ballaugh, there's a great community, and that's something which I think is very special. I think a few years ago when we had a civic service, the then chairman of the commissioners invited representatives of various organisations in the village. Now, bear in mind the population of the Ballaugh parish is probably only between 12 and 1,300. And there was something like 10 or 11 different organisations, which is pretty amazing.
It is.
For a small community like that. But there is a great sense of community.
Yeah, it's kind of...
I like that very much. And I think that probably applies right across the island.
I'm sure you're right. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm in around and a similar sort of thing, watching the local pantomime troupe performing.
Yes.
It's one of the great things about being on the Isle of Man, you're right. What would you say the main challenges are that the Isle of Man faces?
You mean financially or socially or...?
Well, either, I suppose.
I suppose nowadays they're in many ways the same sort of challenges that other places face. In years gone by, I think they were different. In the 1960s, for instance, the challenge was just to keep going.
Yes, to keep the population
from
moving further away.
Not just going, but perhaps to increase it a bit and to stabilise it. And of course, we went through a whole lot of series of things then. I think the thing that worries me slightly more than anything else at the moment is the gaming side of it, which I don't particularly like. I know it's provided a lot of income for the island, but I feel that I sort of going back to when the casino was first opened a long time ago, probably the 60s, I think. And remembering the outcry then about it, that this business about it.
Yeah,
but it's so much easier now for people to gamble than it used to be.
Yes, it is. But I suppose I know what you mean, but I heard very recently, in fact, a story that not only is the gaming provides a need for good regulation, anti-money laundering, and there's a centre of excellence in the Isle of Man for actually doing the anti-money laundering for an awful lot of, which makes gambling companies, I suppose, more responsible for who they're dealing with, know your client, and making sure nobody's doing drug running, and I guess that's a
really important aspect of it.
It is. So we, from that perspective, I guess we've led the way in trying to show what good looks like from a regulation point of view, which is the same in financial services. You would hope is what we aspire to be,
and we hope to be leaders.
No, well, without doubt. What solutions and opportunities could you see? I mean, what would you do if you were, say, for a day, the Chief Minister? What would you do? What does good look like?
One of the things that I like about Scandinavia is the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in the society is the narrowest in the world. And I'd like to see that happening in the island, because I think there is quite a gap at the moment, and a bigger gap than there should be. I know it's inevitable that there will be a gap, but I suspect that people who are lower paid are doing jobs which are vitally important to us, but they're not getting the recognition for it. And I think that's important, that people should get recognition for whatever job they're doing. If it's a valuable job, whatever level they're doing it at, they should get recognition for it and reward.
It's a real social challenge, isn't it? I suppose it comes down to the way in which we value people, value jobs and value roles.
Yeah. I remember the village where my parents lived for a while. in Oxfordshire, and it was still a great estate. It had been a great estate, but it had to be broken up because there were double death duties paid when father died in a car crash and son died just a few minutes later, so there was double death duty to be paid.
Goodness.
But there was still this sense of community in the village. And so, for instance, the man who swept the roads was as valued as anyone else because he would be out early in the morning. If there'd been a snowfall, he was clearing the paths. So his value was so important in the society as the person who was actually running the estate.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we clearly there are a lot of social issues today, and that have been throughout humanity, and how we continue to wrestle with that is a well, I don't know. I don't think I'd envy anybody in that task to try and figure it out. But it's a certainly a laudable ambition. Yeah, I like that. So for any aspiring public speaker, I've had to make a few presentations, speak in public a few times, and I have to confess I really, really do not enjoy it at all. In fact, podcasting is probably my most comfortable method of talking in public, shall we say, because there's nobody listening. Actually, no one's listening. So how do you want to tell us how you've overcome any fear that you might have had of public speaking?
Well, I used to be very wary about it, quite frightened of it. If we were at school, for instance, and had to do a debate or stand up and talk for a minute about something. And then I suppose with performance, musical performance, that helps it. Because you know you've got to communicate in some way. But I think the thing is really just to make sure that, certainly as I got more confident, it was because I knew that I was getting feedback from people, I was getting a response from them. I think it must be awful to be in an audience where there is a sort of blank feeling about it. You know, as a performer of music, that there is something that comes back from the audience.
Well, there is, but it's very different to playing a flute in a concert or something compared to standing up and saying something. I mean, I've done it, but yes, I know what you mean about the carryover from a musical point of view.
Yeah. So I think that helps a lot, being in front of an audience and being up on a stage. It took me a long time to get used to it initially.
So you don't get nervous now?
No, I don't get nervous in that sense. I don't sort of go all shaky and trembly, but I have to sort of try and get myself in the mood so that I'm ready. I try and know what I'm going to say in the first couple of sentences, and once those are over.
Yes, okay.
And I remember someone giving me some very good advice a long time ago, and he said, don't say anything important for the first minute, because people are getting used to what you look like, what you're wearing, they're getting used to your voice.
Yeah.
So just talk about anything in the first minute or so, just so that they can get the hang of who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah, okay, that's really, really good advice. Okay, I'll bear that in mind. Right, so what's next up for you, for your project, or any projects in the pipeline you can tell us about?
Well, yes, there are various projects. One is that my husband's father was commanding officer of the RAF squadron, one of the squadrons that got the Tirpitz. But we were on a cruise recently, and one of my fellow lecturers was someone who is an RAF historian, and he was able to get us a lot of information that we didn't have before about Michael's father. So that's something we've got to try and get right through his RAF career from before the war to 1945 or early 46.
Oh, it's good job. Has a professor research to do this.
So that's going to take up quite a lot of time.
Yeah.
And also I'm much involved with the Bluff Heritage Trust.
Yes.
And putting together a paper with a couple of others, Sarah Christian and Ian Radcliffe. We put an exhibition together 2 years ago now on the tradesmen of Bluff, and we're preparing that now for publication.
So that's going to be an actual book.
That's going to be part of the it's published as part of the series that the antiquarians do.
Okay, that sounds exciting. If you could give me details of that, we normally do is we put them in the show notes so that listeners can go find more details of that later on. Fenella, as we start to wrap up, I'd like to ask you a few quick-fire questions that our listeners are always interested in, if that's okay.
Do you need quick-fire answers?
Well, we'll see. Let's see how we get on. Okay, so what do you do to relax?
Read, garden. Probably, if I'm feeling tense, I would go upstairs and play some Bach on the piano.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Which particular pieces?
Some of the preludes from the 48 Preludes and Fugues.
Lovely. Who are some of the people that you most admire?
There are so many of them, I think, who've been influences or... certainly Mona Douglas was an amazing person because when you think she started the Cruineach or revived the Cruineach, was she, whether she's 70 or 80 when she did that? I think she might have been 80.
I think she might have been. She wasn't going to take no for an answer.
Oh, she wasn't. So she was very determined, and considering she hadn't been able to go to school as a child because she'd been so frail, it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, she was an absolute inspiration, and of course, an early female success story, which is always difficult in a man's world sometimes, I think.
Well, she wasn't going to let that stop.
No, I know. I'd like to think that's common with most of the women I know. So, Fenella, have you had any books that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our listeners?
The book that's had a lot of influence on me, or certainly stayed with me in a way that hardly any other novel has done, is one by Helen Dunmore, which was about the siege of Leningrad. It's simply called Siege. And it's a very powerful book, told from a lot of research she's done, but how this siege of Leningrad went on in the Second World War, and her descriptions of the things that people had to do to survive were quite extraordinary. So it's a very powerful book, a very powerful novel.
Right. Well, that's certainly one to look up. And I think you and your husband Michael have a shared admiration of this particular book that you just got for me.
Well, this is one that we discovered fairly recently, and it's a book by Christopher de Hamel, Hamel, and it's called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. And these are manuscripts, including books like the Book of Kells, the illuminated manuscripts, where he traces their origins, he writes about them. But it's not just writing about them, it's almost as if he says it's almost like interviewing a manuscript to try and find out what is behind it and why it was written and who did it and where it's been since, which is fascinating.
So it's a real insight into what people were thinking at the time and maybe how we've evolved or developed to where we are today.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you. What's your favourite quote?
Well, it's one I don't use myself, but I love. It was one that my father's mother used to use, which was cutting up old moons to make stars.
Okay.
Which is a much better way of saying make, do and mend.
Yeah, that's a really quite profound saying, and especially in today's world, isn't it?
Exactly.
Where we just throw it out and buy new.
This was recycling it at its best, cutting up old moons to make stars.
Yeah, we could take a lot from that, couldn't we, in today's life? Yeah, that's a good one. Thanks. So finally, where can people go to find out more about you and the work that you're doing through your speaking and charities and organisations that you're involved with?
I don't have a website myself.
No.
So it's a bit hit and miss if people want to find out about me. I'm on LinkedIn.
Yes.
But again, that doesn't give a lot of information. It's fairly sort of skeletal.
Would Viking Cruises have details?
Yes, they would.
Yes. Okay, maybe we could put those in the show notes.
Yes, if you looked up cruise ship speakers something or other. I can't remember. It's com on net.
Yeah, that's okay.
Or if you put in my name and cruise ship speaker, that'll bring it up.
Yeah, sure.
That I do.
Okay. Well, for the benefit of our listeners, I'll make sure I link those in the resources on the show notes.
Right.
But Fenella, thank you for joining us here on Island Influences. It's been a pleasure to get to know your story. And that wraps up another episode of the Island Influencers podcast. So make sure to check out our guests' information, pay it a visit, and help spread the word about what they're doing. I mean, if you've got any questions or know somebody who would be a guest on the show, please feel free to get in touch. I'd also love it if you could go to iTunes and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We work hard to bring on some great guests, and getting a review from you is one way to help the podcast integrate well on iTunes. So I hope that others can find and enjoy the show too. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Island Influencers from Thornton Chartered Financial Planners. To find out more and for useful links, visit thorntonfs.com/podcasts.